Hi class, welcome to our first video on Bloodchild. This is a mountain that is ever more thematic to what we're here to discuss. This is Butler Mons, and it's on the dwarf planet of Pluto, way out there past Neptune and all that. And it was named after our author, Octavia E. Butler, and we're here to discuss today her short story, Bloodchild. And this short story is one, as you can see here from this book, that is in a collection of short stories that came out in the 80s. And it is a very famous short story and much discussed, and certainly an example of a good story. However, it is a good story that has a complexity to it that I think requires us to break down some simple things to begin with. But regardless, once we're more comfortable with those things, and hopefully you have become more comfortable with them from reading the story a couple of times, I do argue that it is a very compelling story that brings up a lot of very interesting themes that hopefully will start to make more and more sense as we discuss these things in this video as well as in another video. Okay, as said, this is a two-parter, and this is our first video, and these are the four things that we will discuss. Characters and exposition, the joining of the families, Tagatoi, alien head of a human family, and gone before the Brom Lomas incident. Now, in my experience from having taught this story a few times, one of the more difficult things for students to sort of make sense of is all these different characters and their strange character names. And I think the easiest way to make sense of this, or to keep a good sense of who is who and who is who to who and what and all those kinds of things, is to really focus in on the exposition and background. Now, by exposition, we mean all that stuff that happens before a story begins. Again, another word for that is background. And with a story like this, it's very helpful if you have a sense of that background, because I think when you have a sense of that, it becomes clearer who's who to whom and what these characters' relationships are, especially in terms of their power dynamics, something we'll discuss in the second video. So, here is a rough summary of what has happened before the story begins. Fleeing a planet where their own kind had killed or enslaved them, human beings arrive at the Talik's planet. Once there, they are referred to as Terrans and forced to become hosts for the fetus worms of the Talik. Over time, however, the relationship has developed into a more peaceful transaction between the Talik and the Terrans, who largely live in the preserve. And here we have a quote from Tagatoi, a character we will discuss more below. And she says here, referring to what had happened before the story begins, quote, "The animals we once used began killing most of our eggs after implantation, long before your ancestors arrived. And your ancestors, reeling from their home world, from their own kind who have killed or enslaved them, they survived because of us. We saw them as people and gave them the preserve when they still tried to kill us as worms." So, with that in mind, I think it becomes clear that even though, for example, these two major groups have the same letter name in common, it becomes clearer who these people are to each other. These people are aliens, the Talik, but only to us, the human beings, because this is their native planet, right? And us human beings have landed on their planet and are referred to by them as the Terrans, okay? And then we have these characters, which some of them we will discuss in great detail, but you should be familiar with by now. We have Gon, who is the narrator. He is the main character, the protagonist, and he is what's called a possible Talik. And that is somebody who would carry these aliens, people, right? Carry their worms to at the beginning of their development in terms of pregnancy, right? So this is a major character, and our other major character is Tagatoi, who is an alien or a Talik, but is also the head of Gon's family, something we'll discuss below. And then we have other Terran or human characters, Lean, Hoa, Ki, and Brom Lomas. These three characters, Gon, Lean, Hoa, and Ki, four characters, are all a part of Gon's family, right? Obviously, Gon is a part of his own family. And then you have Brom Lomas, who is a different human being, but his role, as we will discuss, is very important in terms of an incident that happens halfway through the story. And this character you don't need to know much about, but it's a character that appears at some point and is the head of Bram Lomas's family. So, with that exposition out of the way, we can start to discuss some of the three major dynamics that are taking place in this story. There is this notion of the joining of the families, and then these two major characters, and the relationship between these two characters. This is very essential for making sense of what's going on in this story. So, as you know from reading the story, there is a major conflict taking place, which is between the Terrans and the Taliks and the question of exploitation, and whether or not human beings are in an equitable or equal feeling relationship with these aliens. And the debate comes down to a question about whether or not this is simply exploitation or this is a fair exchange between two groups. And one place where it really helps to make sense of this is this notion of the preserve, right? So to read this first part, we have this quote where Gon narrates this idea that firearms were illegal in the preserve. And the preserve, again, is where the human beings live. There had been incidents right after the preserve was established. Terrans shooting Talik, shooting in Talik. This was before the joining of the families began, before everyone had a personal stake in keeping the peace. No one had shot a Talik in my lifetime or my mother's, but the law still stood. For our protection, we were told. So, more exposition here. The idea is that in the past, these two groups, the Talik and the Terrans, the aliens and the human beings, had some animosity. But now things have become increasingly more peaceful. But there is this interesting element to this story, and I think it's one of the reasons it's something of relevance for us today, is that although this peace, this sense of unity exists, underneath the surface is this bubbling tension in which no one is necessarily completely satisfied or happy with things as they stand. Here we have a summary of the idea that Tagatoi is somebody who advocates for a peaceful relationship in the preserve, but there are other aliens who don't see why they can't simply exploit the human beings, right? That they don't understand that these people should be treated with dignity instead of just simply being courted, paid, and drafted and in some way made available to them. So there's a tension that exists there. As Tagatoi admits here, the arrival of the Terran people has made the Taliks a healthy and thriving group. So there is a resentment that perhaps exists in which these human beings feel like the aliens are gaining something from them in this transaction, but they are not receiving something in return which feels like a fair compensation. But what makes this story interesting, like many compelling stories, is that we have a character who does not necessarily feel this way, but changes over time. Because Gon, the main character, a human being, is fine with the aliens. He has a comfortable relationship with them. He says here, I had always found it comfortable to lie that way, but except for my older sister, no one else in the family liked it. They said it made them feel caged. And by caged, she refers to being embraced by Tagatoi. And here we have a description of what this alien head of the human family looks like. She had bones, ribs, a long spine, a skull, 4 sets of limb bones per segment. But when she moved that way, twisting, hurling herself into controlled falls, landing, running, she seemed not only boneless but aquatic, something swimming through the air as though it were water. I loved watching her move. Again, this is interesting because as we've discussed already, human beings resented the aliens and then there was an embrace and a joining of the families, but a tension still exists. But when this story begins, Gon doesn't see a problem. He's like, I found it comfortable, right? When his mother hesitates in an embrace with Tagatoi, he doesn't get it. He says, my mother hesitated for no reason that I could see. Because he has been chosen to be one of these in-Talik, Terran carriers of Talik's worm children. This is something he's been told since he was young he is going to do. As it's described here, my older sister took an instant liking to Tagatoy and wanted to be chosen to be this interleague. But my mother was just coming to term with me, and Tagatoy liked the idea of choosing an infant and watching and taking part in all the phases of development. I'm told I was first caged within Tagatoy's many limbs only 3 minutes after my birth. A few days later, I was given my first taste of egg. I tell Tarans that when they ask whether I was ever afraid of her. Again, this is something he's always been comfortable with. Forgive me if it sounds somewhat gross, but it's known that sheep farmers, people that raise sheep, that in order to help their sheep give birth, they themselves will reach into the birth canal of sheep in order to help the baby come out of the sheep, so that when these baby sheep are born, right, these lambs are born, they first encounter a human being's touch, so that throughout their raising, throughout their lives, they have a intimate and friendly relationship with human beings, and therefore aren't necessarily afraid of the sheep farmer or anyone related to them, and therefore have a degree of comfort that we might not necessarily have with a foreign species. Now, the point, though, that we need to keep in mind is that this is a story, and in any story, there is some sort of conflict. And everything we've discussed is historical conflict, conflict that existed before the story began, that has now seemingly been resolved. And Gon is the classic example of somebody who doesn't see a problem until he does see a problem. So in the second video, we're going to discuss this notion of the Bram Lomas incident and everything that happens after this revelatory moment. Okay, so we'll stop there, and in the next video, we'll discuss what happens after this Bram Lomas incident and what it might mean and the implications for all of that with regards to writing these papers and thinking about the significance of this for our own work. Okay, until I see you again in part 2.